Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to this Policy Exchange event, which, under the working title, Beyond Consumerism, How Should Free Market Economies Plan for the Future? It seems to me, one of the reasons I was so keen to bring together this event this evening, that there's an interesting kind of complex of issues, new issues, which have become interesting to policymakers. We have a government, for example, which has said that general well-being is as important as GDP. You have a Prime Minister who's very committed to his idea of the big society. Now, what is he tapping into then? He's tapping into fears about the fraying of our society, the kind of fears perhaps expressed by Robert Putnam in his book Bowling Alone. He's also tapping into a sort of fear, also backed up by some academics, that more material goods will not necessarily make us happy beyond a certain point. In fact, they might make us less happy. Today, interestingly, sees the launch of a new campaign group, Action for Happiness, an interesting new development. So while that's going on, there's also a kind of more general rethinking after the credit crunch about what you might call sustainability. People starting to think about demographics. In fact, David Willetts's book seems to have launched a whole series of books on intergenerational fairness. His book, The Pinch, which he talked about Policy Exchange before, asked big questions about how we can make our finances, the government's finances, demographically sustainable. People got very interested in the savings rate. In fact, during the financial crisis, the Prime Minister talked about moving from a culture of spend, send, to save, save, save. And of course, more than anything else, people have become very interested in the environment. How can we plan for the needs of future generations while satisfying our own wants? So we have this complex of challenges around sustainability. Now, that raises a whole series of questions for those of us who are interested in public policy. How can we manage any of these things? How can we measure them? For example, how do we discount the future against today? What kind of discount rate should we be using? How on earth do we put a value on the environment? How do we measure what it is worth to conserve resources for tomorrow? How can we measure, in fact, happiness or contentment? Some of you might have been here for Professor Chichele's speech last week. He was looking at time studies, how people spend their time and how happy they are. So there's a series of challenges about measurement, and some of those are borne out in the discussion that there is at the Office of National Statistics at the moment, where there is an attempt to construct an index of well-being, which is an interesting project. The second set of kind of policy challenges are about whether the government can do anything to change character or our society. So politicians, we know, can do things that influence the path of the economy. They can do things that will change the shape of our public services. But can they change our society? I look at the DCLG citizenship survey, I look at the rate of volunteering, so the big society is partly about volunteering. Can politicians actually create a culture of volunteerism? Can we move any of these indicators? Can politicians make any difference? Anyway, enough of rambling from me. I think these are all extremely interesting issues. Unfortunately, we have with us this evening two people who've been thinking a lot about them. Diane Coyle is the Managing Director of Enlightenment Economics. She has a new book out, The Economics of Enough, which actually you can buy a copy later on if you're excited about it. How to run the economy as if the future matters. And she'll be talking first this evening. And our second guest this evening is Professor Avner Offer. He is a Professor of Economic History at the University of Oxford. And he has been thinking about these issues for many years, and he's written many different books. And one of his more recent ones is The Challenge of Affluence, which is an incredibly interesting read. It looks at a whole range of different issues in a very interesting and provocative way. And a way which is, I would say, quite challenging for those of us coming from a free market point of view, because a lot of these different criticisms are challenges to what you might call kind of a neoliberal orthodoxy. So, without any further ado from me this evening, it's my brilliant pleasure to be able to hand over to Diane. Thank you so much for coming.
Thank you. I was sitting, listening to the radio this morning, pondering how to start my talk this evening, and an item came on about Action for Happiness, the campaign group that we just heard about, launched by Richard Layard, who wrote a happiness book many years ago now, actually, I think about 10 years ago now. So I had a look at the website after I'd finished shouting at the Today programme, and it says a lot of very sensible things, actually. The positive psychology lessons are really important, and there's a lot of common sense. But it seems to me it's common sense for individuals rather than for policy. And the thing that made me shout at my computer is the first of the 20 happiness facts. Surveys in Britain and the US show that people are no happier now than in the 1950s, despite massive economic growth. Well, that's the kind of fact that I don't like because it's wrong. How do you measure happiness? The way it's measured in the surveys that the website's referring to is by going around asking a lot of people, are you feeling unhappy, content, very happy? Sometimes 3, sometimes 5, sometimes 10, a scale. But it can't go above whatever the top number in that scale is. And on a scale of 1 to 3, we're at 2.6 in the UK. So whatever happens to GDP, happiness is not going to go up all that much further. GDP itself is an artificial number. It's almost a metaphor that we have created, devised in the 30s as a way of measuring the amount of output in the economy, which seemed important at the time. But it can start at 0. It starts at 0 and it can rise without limit to whatever happens to the economy. And it's increasingly, in an economy based on services and intangibles, an intangible concept. It's things like clever design, or the ideas embodied in new medicines, or the services that we perform for each other. It's not just more and more stuff, and it can carry on rising. So I want to make 2 points about this. One is that saying that GDP growth matters doesn't mean that you're a crass materialist. And the second is that the so-called Easterlin paradox, the conventional wisdom that economic growth doesn't make people happier, is just wrong. And because of the way the statistics are created, GDP and happiness just can't rise at the same pace. But if you correct the GDP figures and take the logarithm so it becomes a series with a limit, the same kind of statistical properties as the happiness, then they are strongly correlated. And this is taken from a paper by Justin Wolfers and Betsy Stevenson. It's one of several regressions they run with a log of GDP per capita and happiness measures, life satisfaction measures. And no matter what GDP you go up to on the scale, happiness carries on rising with GDP. This should be obvious, actually. If it wasn't true, why would we care about recessions and GDP going down? Recessions are incredibly unpopular with people. Companies become more productive. They figure out how to produce the same amount of output or services more efficiently over time. So if we didn't need any growth, then employment would fall. And that's another reason why we care about GDP growth. If growth didn't matter, why would we care about reducing poverty? The argument that people in the positive psychology movement make is that there's adaptation, that we all grew up perhaps without central heating or cars or consumer goods and we were very happy. We've got the goods now, we're just as happy. It's because we've adapted to what we have. But if adaptation is at play, why would you bother about improving the lot of people who live in a council estate in the North East? Because they can adapt and they can be just as happy as any of us with all our consumer goods. So GDP matters a lot, not just because it makes people happy, but because it's a measure of innovation and individual possibilities, and actually it's absolutely key to how capitalism increases welfare. In fact, GDP massively understates the improvements. There are a lot of calculations that show that the way it's constructed massively understates the welfare benefits and the price improvements in new innovations. Just to give you a couple of examples, in David Lander's book about the history of the wealth of nations, I forget the exact title, I'm sure Avner knows it, he gives the example of Nathan Mayer Rothschild dying of a burst abscess for want of a very cheap antibiotic in today's terms. It just hadn't been invented. The richest man in the world couldn't be saved.
Still can't be saved.
Still can't be saved. I don't know if you remember, in the year 2000, there was a TV series called The 1900 Hats, and a nice middle-class family was sent back to live in the exact conditions of 1900. And the mother almost walked out on the experiment, not because she didn't like the tea they had in those days, not because she had to heat up water in the copper boiler to do the laundry, not because she had to cook everything from scratch and grow vegetables. It's because she couldn't get shampoo and her hair was too dirty, and she burst into tears on camera and almost walked out of the experiment because of that. Even apparently trivial innovations have a big impact on consumer welfare. And it's not just stuff, it's not just shampoo, it's not just digital cameras, it's not just electric cars. It's also now 2/3 of it services and intangibles. So what GDP is measuring is people being landscape gardeners or ballet dancers or artists or care assistants in our ageing populations. So the anti-growth movement, of which I think the happiness gurus are definitely a part, are really a movement of romantic nihilism. And whenever I think about that, I think about Ruskin and Unto This Last. And there's this great quote from it. He says, "Wealth, therefore, is the possession of the valuable by the valiant, and in considering it as a power existing in a nation, the two elements, the value of the thing and the valour of its possessor, must be estimated together. Whence it appears that many of the persons commonly considered wealthy are in reality no more wealthy than the locks of their own strong boxes, and operating for the nation in an economical point of view, either as pools of dead water and eddies in a stream, or else as dams in a river, of which the ultimate service depends not on the dam but the miller, or else as mere accidental stays and impediments, acting not as wealth but as ilth, causing various devastation and trouble around them in all directions." He'd have had a ball these days, wouldn't he? But GDP growth is both desired by people, by voters in democracies, and desirable. It's politically and morally essential to find ways for the economy to continue growing, but to continue growing sustainably. That is, growing for tomorrow as well as for today, and with an eye to a longer-term time horizon than is common in many areas of policy. And sustainability isn't just an environmental issue, although that's the first place that many people leap when you start to talk about it. But it's financial, it's social, it's political as well. The book tells the story of my own personal experience in October 2008, the weekend that Lehman Brothers collapsed. And I was looking at the interest rate in the interbank markets, the rate at which banks lend to each other overnight, and it was going off the charts in the Financial Times. And I thought, well, if the banks don't trust each other with each other's money overnight, I don't trust them either. And I went to the cash machine every day for the next week and took out as much as it would let me. And then I figured that I shop at Waitrose. They wouldn't be able to make electronic payments for all the goods in the store if the system was going to break down like that. So I would go to Waitrose and stock up on canned goods and water, so I did that too. This is a pretty serious state for a capitalist economy to get to. This is pretty fundamental stuff. I think the crisis makes it apparent that we were not at a point of financial sustainability. And if you look now at Portugal and Greece and Ireland and Iceland, I think it's clear that the story isn't over. The letter in the FT this morning points out the debts that cannot be repaid will not be repaid. It's not going to happen. There's going to be defaults in those countries and much more of the financial crisis. The Germans will realise that they either have to bail out Greece and Portugal or they have to bail out their own banks, but they're going to be bailing out somebody. Yes. But that's not half of it, actually, because in all of the Western economies there are also implicit debts through commitments to future spending not covered by taxes. And any calculations that there are of the amount of tax increase that's needed to cover the structures of welfare payments, medical payments, pension payments that we have in place at the moment suggest that they are just not going to be coverable, and that much as taxpayers won't pay to bail out foreign European economies, they're not going to pay to cover the commitments made to ageing populations. And these are not things that national statistical offices collect systematically, but this is from the latest National Institute figures. They do them for the UK. And they show that the revenues on the current tax system, actually this predates the budget, it's from last summer, and expenditures on the current welfare and pension system. And that gap is, depending on what you think your goal is it a balanced budget or is it something less than that, is about a 15 to 20% increase in taxes from where we stand now. And that seems politically implausible, I would say. Larry Kotlikov has done figures for the US, which are also extremely large and absolutely dwarf the scale of the current deficit and the national debt. So, as well as the environmental issues, which I wasn't planning to talk about this evening, there are questions of financial sustainability. Also, of course, inequality, social opportunity, and large sections of the population, especially in the US and the UK, where there is an absence of opportunity now. Fairness is a very strong instinct. I spent some time kind of surveying quickly the literature, the evolutionary literature on fairness. It seems to be a very strong instinct in the way that people organise societies. And divided societies, very unequal ones, are low-trust societies. All economies are built on trust, if you're not in a straightforward barter economy with no transactions taking place over time and not face-to-face, then trust matters. And in a high-tech, globalized economy, trust becomes increasingly important. We have supply chains that stretch all the way across the world, where credit is extended for months at a time to people who are completely unknown. There are very many and very distant transactions. And the economic activity that these transactions are sustaining is, as I said before, almost entirely intangible. And intangible value can be large, but it's fragile. And you only have to think about the speed with which it has evaporated. Think about Enron, or Lehman Brothers for that matter, very large corporations whose value literally vanished overnight. Or how much damage can be done to reputation if you think about a company like BP, which has very large physical, real assets, oil, which is a really important thing to own, but how much the company was damaged by its reputational impact. So all of these multiple crises, I think, are linked by a common theme. I mean, actually, it's probably insanely ambitious to try and link them all together, but I try. And that is, I think, the undervaluing of the future compared to the present. And we are failing in our duties of stewardship towards future generations. And actually, the pressures of modern public life make it very difficult to be long-term. We have politics by the next hour's headlines or the next tweet. It's true in finance as well, and anybody who's got any contact with businesses will know that the pressures of large investors make companies focus on quarter-by-quarter share price movements, or even faster movements than that, even though they're very long-term investors, pensions and life funds. And I've been carrying around this quote from Paul Polman of Unilever, because it's so unusual. He was on an analyst phone call, was asked whether something would damage the share price. He said, Unilever's been around for 100 plus years. We want to be around for several hundred more years. So if you buy into this long-term value creation model, which is equitable, shared and sustainable, then come and invest with us. If you don't buy into this, I respect you as a human being, but don't put your money into our company. And what's striking about that is that he's the only chief executive of a large company I've ever heard say anything of the kind. The pressures to be short-term are really intense. So what can we do about being short-term? And I wish I could give you a big answer, an easy answer, but I don't think there is a big idea solution, and I'm rather suspicious of them. But I divide what can be done into 3 headings. And the first is measurement. I've always thought statistics are really important. I've argued that GDP matters a lot. It's a measure of increasing freedom and capability, ultimately. Innovations, even the most trivial, make a big difference to people's welfare and their capabilities. So I certainly don't want us to ditch GDP, but I think we need to add a range of other indicators as well. The psychology literature is very clear about some things that make people unhappy. Of course we should look at those. Commuting, unemployment, noise, perfectly sensible to look at them. There's a great example called Measuring Australia's Progress, where they look at a number of indicators of this kind over time. And this chart shows some of the main indicators in the annual survey and their movement over a 10-year period. Some can go up, some can go down. They're not all merged into one indicator. And what's really interesting about the exercise is not only that it's annual, but that they ask people every year what should be included. So they have a survey, and they have a website and a blog, and you can engage with the statisticians about what you want to see included in next year's surveys. The Sarkozy Commission with Amartya Sen and Joseph Stiglitz has recommended something similar, and I think these are perfectly sensible. But more important, I think, measure things that are happening over time. So I already referred to the generational accounts, and I strongly advocate as well something called comprehensive wealth. The thing about measuring wealth is that it, in a company, as in a nation, is that it focuses you on whether you're eating capital to consume today, and goes directly to that question of sustainability and how well off can future generations be from what you're investing for them. And there is a concept called comprehensive wealth, which people at the World Bank in particular are trying to construct, which includes financial and physical assets, but also natural capital and human capital and social capital as well. So a lot of these are hard to define, hard to measure, but GDP was hard to define and measure in the first place. And I think comprehensive wealth is absolutely the kind of indicator that we need to develop now for the times that we're in. So measurement is my first heading. The second heading is institutions, which is the name we give to anything that links us together collectively and that links us to the future beyond our individual lifespan. Institutions can have a much longer lifetime than any individual. So to improve stewardship of the economy for the future, we need to look at institutional reforms, which is actually a huge subject, and the fact that it's talked, governance and institutions are talked about in so many different contexts is an indicator, I think, of a widespread mismatch between the reality of the economy and global society and the absence of change in the capability of institutions across the board to respond to it. The private sector has been much faster to adapt and companies have changed a lot, but public sector institutions have changed relatively little. And a good example is actually in the environment, which is a climate change, a global problem, pressing problem, if you believe the gloomier scientific forecast that the action needed is urgent. And if you look at ClimateGate and the IPCC and the scandals over those, there has been a huge crisis of institutional legitimacy that have damaged any attempts to address climate change at any level above the national. It's now, at the moment, I think, up to single national governments entirely. So I don't think there's a single recipe for institutional reform. But the world is transparent, and the pressures of popular access to information mean that institutional reforms will have to address this issue of how to provide information in a transparent way and engage with people much more widely than in the past. Paradoxically, the only way to avoid hyper-populism is to engage much more directly with people, and there are lots of experiments in using online techniques to do that. And the third leg is values, which is not a fashionable thing for an economist to say these days, but it's where economics started with Adam Smith. And I think many people, many economists certainly have come to acknowledge that capitalism needs an ethical compass to work well. We want the economy to be efficient, we want freedom, we want fairness, all three at the same time, and it's very difficult to achieve all three of them simultaneously. When you push on two fronts, you lose sight of the other and the stool falls over. Fairness is the one that we have been overlooking, at least in the Anglo-Saxon economies in the past 10 years. But I think Paul Polman isn't alone, and I think that there probably is a time, as we just heard. The time is right, people are interested. There is a time politically for people to seize the moment and an appetite for change and for values. And so I thought I'd end with actually the last paragraph of the book, which is about the importance of the future. 2 centuries ago, in the early stages of the Industrial Revolution, and again just over 1 century ago, in the high Victorian era, the restless dynamism of capitalism and the upheaval caused by new technologies presented our forebears with similar challenges to the ones we in the West face now. We still rely on some of the investments they made in response to the challenges of their times and on the institutions they created. To look at some of the masterpieces of late 19th and early 20th century architecture or engineering is to be awed by the confidence those responsible were expressing in the future and by the commitment they made to it. Less visible, but no less important, are the political, legal, and social institutions they bequeathed to their successor generations. What is our legacy going to be? So I'll stop there and hand over to Evan. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dan.
Yeah, maybe we can just change places.
Yes.
That's all right. That's all right. I hope so. Okay. Well, I suppose I'm going to begin exactly where the previous speaker ended. What is our legacy going to be? Not working. It's not on. No? That's all right. That's it. Okay. So, I'm also going to talk about the future, but possibly a different future. I lay my wares. I'm an historian, I'm partly an historian. And when I describe the past, I don't try to change it. And so when I'm talking about the future, I also want to describe it, but not to change it. My aspiration is not to change. Not that I don't have my own views, I do have my views, but I'll try not to bring them in too much. So the basic premise is that the past has been shaped by myopia, and the future is also going to be shaped by myopia. So what is myopia? Oh yes, there's a bit of, well, we're all selling books here, so this is available in paper. Okay. There's a bit of technology in this paper, and you can find the technology in this book. So that's a justification for showing it. So what is myopia? To introduce it, I'll show an optical analogy. So these are rays of light, and we have two payoffs, one 120, one 100, at some remote distance, and the lady in this picture can evaluate, can rank them correctly. So she sees correctly that 120 is more than 100 pounds. Now think of these are rays of light, but there's an argument that that is actually a good representation of how the circuits in our mind work. So now she moves a little closer. She moves a little closer to the light, and look what happens to the rays. There's a preference reversal. Sorry. You see? The green, the 100 pounds becomes worth more to her than the 120 pounds. This phenomenon goes under a number of names: myopia, impatience, time inconsistency, and in recent decades it's been validated in several disciplines: in animal behavior, psychology, economics, neuroscience. So let's look at it a little more closely. We're worried about the future. We have a procedure for dealing with the future. That procedure is called discounting. The problem is, how much do we want to invest in future payoffs? And there are two methods to approach this, two methods to do this. So here is the same picture, basically, that we had before. Here's our lady, she's still there. Well, it doesn't show. Here she is. And the first method, think of reds and think of blues. So the first method is called exponential discounting. These are the two red lines, or the purple and the red, and you can see they're rather similar to the first slide I showed. This is a procedure which is both consistent and normative. Consistent means that you rank the two payoffs the same regardless of the delay, regardless of your distance from the payoff. So you always rank them the same, regardless of how close or how far from it. This method is also normative. It's normative in the sense that it means that if you want to get rich, that's what you want to do. This is the most efficient way of evaluating the future. Okay. Then there's another method, which is represented by the blue lines. The blue lines, think of the blue lines a bit like my second slide. By the way, this is the equation for those of you who like equations. Everyone else can ignore them. I can talk about it more if you want later. So the second method is called hyperbolic discounting. It's not the only method. In fact, every other method that's not exponential discounting is not consistent. That's the important thing. It's not consistent. So let's take our lady once again, and you can see that from a distance, at the outset, she ranks the two payoffs correctly. The 200 is ranked more highly than the 100 pounds. But as she approaches the payoffs, you can see that the ratios between the two are not constant. And in fact, she reaches a crossover point. You're at number 5, where the two look equal. And you can see that whether she values the 200 or the 100 depends on the delay. So 1 unit before, this can be, by the way, these units can be an hour or a day or a year or whatever. These are units of time. And it's a different one if it's 1 unit after. So you can see that there's no stable preference here. It depends on where you are relative to the payoff. And this is the equation. Now, the problem with this, oh yes, what should I say about this? First, it's time inconsistent. It's time inconsistent in the sense that the ranking of the payoff is not invariant to time. It changes with time. The other thing is it's positive. This is a big claim. The claim is that that is how we actually do it. Not the efficient way, that is the way we actually do it. And if that's the way we do it, then calculation is generally intractable. This is a very disturbing thought, especially for economists, that you cannot actually calculate an optimum. At this point, sorry. Okay, I'll skip this. So that faces us with an intertemporal dilemma, because myopia may be our natural method of discounting. Not the efficient exponential method, but the myopic method may be the natural way we do discounting. What that means is that there's no maximizing algorithm available. There's no way of calculating an optimum. One day we generally want the 200, the other day we generally want the 100 more, and there's really no way to mediate between these two. There's a suspicion that this bias is hardwired. Neuroeconomics has found evidence that it's hardwired, that maybe it's come from evolution. Now, if all of this is correct, choices still have to be made, even if we can't calculate an optimum. So how do choices get made? The problem is one of commitment. The problem is how to sacrifice something now in return for something better later. And in order to do that, instead of calculation, we fall back on social conventions, on norms, on institutions, on things that have worked before. I call these commitment devices. Think of things like education, or marriage, or insurance, or war is actually another example of this kind of thing. So we solve problems without calculation. We solve problems by convention, through institutions, through experience, things of that sort. But these commitment devices take time to form, but this wonderful flow of innovation that we've heard about before actually undermines our commitment devices. Let's look, for example, at the effect of... so affluence actually imparts a myopic bias. So here's an example of economic growth. This is the price of the Big Mac in 11 countries. And you can see that economic growth is bringing the cost down, and it's the lowest in the English-speaking countries. And using the same countries, something else is growing. And what is growing is body weight over time. So these two things may be related. So this is an example why more is not always necessarily better. Okay, let's shift gear now. So now we're talking about globalization, or the larger markets. So the world of globalization is a world of incremental change. This is the world we've been in for the last maybe 30 or 40 years. International trade, comparative advantage, everyone better off. But if you look a little further back, things have not always been so smooth. So in the first half of the 20th century, we've had World War I, and communism, and fascism, and the Great Depression, and World War II. Looking into the future, what sort of future are we going to have? Are we going to have an incremental future, or are we going to have a future of shocks? Well, we don't know. But there's a non-trivial probability of future shocks. I don't want to say what probability, but it's not trivial. And there's a whole list of them. So financial disarray, that's not even in the future, that's happened already. Then we have climate change, energy depletion, food shortages, immigration pressure, the China problem, aging, fiscal crisis, we've heard about that, natural resource scarcity, political violence, runaway technologies. There's a whole range of potential shocks which might or might not hit us. What does such a shock look like? Well, this is quite a well-known diagram from the Stern report on climate change. So in the blue area, you see those lines. It tells us what are the consequences of the concentration of CO2 rising to a certain level. So at 400 ppm CO2, you want to read down the dial to see how much increase in temperature there's going to be. And the answer is that we don't know precisely. the range is actually pretty large. Could be 1 degree, could be 2 degrees, and likewise with every one of them there's actually a big range of uncertainty, and then there are the various consequences that are associated with these temperatures. Once again, it's not very clear. There's a lot of ambiguity about this. Let's see another shot of this kind. This is the peak oil story. So there's a lot of alarmism about this. So I've drawn my data here from official agencies. So this is from an American source, and they say that, don't worry, there's going to be enough oil, there's going to be enough liquid fuels, only we don't know where it's going to come from. So this is the unidentified projects gap that's opening there to about half of the daily supply. The Brits, this is a British one. This is actually a little more precise, but there's a big range of uncertainty. Most of them actually start going down around now in terms of oil. Some of them are still going up. There are 2 that are still going up. So there's quite a wide range of uncertainty here, as you can see. Now, how do we respond to these things? The consequences of this could be serious. So how do we respond to this? There are 3 reactions. One is denial. The second is rationality. And the third is commitment. So let's look at denial first. What is denial? There are 3 kinds of denial. One is to say it's not happening. The second is I don't want to know. And the third is something will turn out. Yes? Okay. Now, the disagreements here are not metaphysical. You know, we disagree on whether free markets are good or bad, but you know, this can never be settled. No one has ever seen a unicorn, and no one has ever seen a free market. Think of it more like a football game. So think of it like a football game. We can quarrel about the relative merits of the 2 teams forever, but on Saturday there's going to be a game, and one of them is going to be to win. So the outcome is objectively true or untrue, although we don't know what it's going to be now. Time will tell, and will tell pretty soon. Now, the risks are compelling, but they fall well short of certainty. We're not really sure this is going to happen, and what form is going to happen. So let's look at forms of denial. The two main forms. One is rational denial. So if you have a special interest, if you're invested in one of these, for example, if you're into tobacco, you don't want to hear about cancer. So if you have a special interest, you have a high time discount, your special interest is worth more than the possible damage to you from collective harm and so on, then you deny, and there's quite a lot of investment in denial of this kind. The other is emotional denial. This is a more myopic type of approach, which is protecting your comfort zone from the unthinkable, which is completely understandable and maybe even the right thing to do if you can't do anything about it. Now, what happens, you can turn this into a social movement when the rational deniers mobilize the emotional deniers against action. Some people say, well, something will turn up. And in fact, things have turned up in the past many times. But I'd say that that's very, very possible, I think. Nevertheless, it's not the prudent approach. It's not prudent because of the asymmetry of outcomes. So if we prepare for the worst and nothing happens, then we suffer a moderate loss, you know. Growth restarts itself, and after a few years, maybe after a few decades, we're back on course. We may have lost a bit of output, but we're okay. If we do nothing and the worst happens, then we're in trouble. So that's one reaction, denial. Second reaction is rationality. You might think rationality is the right thing to do. Indeed, it is the right thing to do. So if the benefits exceeds the cost, you do something. But I'm afraid this doesn't provide the solution. The reason it doesn't provide the solution, yes, the way this problem is usually framed is to ask, what sacrifices should we make now to benefit our richer selves later. So the assumption is that we're going to be richer, we're being called now, poor us are called on to make a sacrifice for richer them later. That's a problem. The main issue here is that the thing that determines whether we should act or not is the discount rate, how much we value the future, and rationality does not specify that. So, Stern report said sacrifice 1% of GDP now for gain of 5 to 20% later, and used a 1.4% discount rate. And that works out as a rational thing to do. At the other extreme, an economist called Nordhaus said you really needed to take realistic discount rates, what a business would pay for its credit, 7%. But if you have a high discount rate, there's really no future. The future ends very soon. So anything that happens further away falls outside your calculations. So what Nordhaus say is not to worry. Now when we become richer, then we can do something about it. But this act later proposal is actually time inconsistent. And we said the time inconsistent doesn't actually give us a choice. Or doesn't identify an optimal choice. Now, in a rational time, you remember the attribute of time consistency. If we act later, we should be acting now as well. If we're going to act later, we should be acting now as well. So the fact that we're not acting now is a diagnostic which tells us whether we're being rational or not. Since we're not doing anything now, that suggests that we're not actually rational, and therefore the rational model is not a good guide to what is going on. So the absence of current action is a diagnostic. Here, I've said that and now I've written it down. Failure to be acting now suggests that our actual model is not rational. If it's not rational, then the problem is not whether it is worth acting. The problem is how to motivate action. And that, as I argued before, requires a commitment device. So we're back to commitment devices. So the third approach is commitment. So this is a prospective emergency with some level of probability. Which commitment device should we choose? Now I've scratched my head about this long and hard, and with great reluctance I've reached for something I don't really like, and that is national security. National security is a social benefit, not a private good, and we have a precedent for this, which looks quite similar in some ways, which is the Cold War. So the Cold War was a nebulous threat on an indefinite time scale, which attracted untrammeled resources and social consent, bipartisanship, international alliances, so it's less calculating than trade. So that provides quite a nice model, it seems to me, for commitment. We've done it before. That's the main point about commitment devices. We've done it before. We've done other things before, by the way. Now, what for? What should we mobilize for? Well, the three things we can do mainly. One is conservation. There's a big payoff for conservation. The other, we can invest in techno-fixes. There may well be various techno-fixes that can, you know, something will turn up, but maybe it won't turn up by itself. Maybe we should look for it. The third is carbon taxes. So these are three things we can do with this mobilization. But it's quite possible that none of these things will be enough. None of these things will work. In which case, we will need Plan B. Now, what is Plan B going to be? I don't want to tell you. Frankly, I don't know. I can't imagine it. I think that the basic principles, we can understand the basic principles. It will either take the form of a free-for-all, or it will take the form of everyone pulling together. But I think that's as much as we can say at this stage. But nevertheless, it would be good to think about Plan B. And in fact, the military are already making Plan B. So the most detailed planning materials actually come from the security agencies. There's a problem with this commitment device, is that we need an enemy. So National security works best if we can identify an enemy. And I'm afraid that the Islamo-fascists will not serve us in this capacity. The enemy here is ourselves. So the shocks are external, and the challenge is to master our intrinsic myopia. And the question that I leave you with, is this a problem that we can solve? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Offer. A fascinating smorgasbord of different issues, really, from both of our speakers this evening. I'm sure that there are lots of questions. We do have a bit of time for questions and answers. If you want to ask, if you put behind also say who you are and where you're from, that would be very helpful. I wonder who wants to go first. Tim.
Yes, I just want to suggest to Avner that the fact that we're not doing something now does not prove we're irrational. Now, I'm not sure whether you're going home by car, by coach, or by train, but for the sake of argument, I'll put you on the train. We know that you want the train to stop in Oxford. That doesn't mean we should apply the brakes the moment you leave Paddington. It makes perfect sense sometimes to go hell for leather, knowing that there is a sensible time in the future at which we want to take action and change our behaviour. So in the case of a train, it's about a mile or so outside of Oxford. That's when you pull the brakes, that's when you stop. But you can sail through Didcot and Reading at very high speed. Well, you'll be lucky these days it's Oxford. But in theory, you could go through these places at very high speed and still reach Oxford safely, and that would be a sensible thing to do. Of course, there is a small risk, because the train will then be going at very high speed, you might crash, etc., the brakes might fail. But still, that's a more sensible strategy than walking home tonight.
Well, with all due respect, this is a rather contrived example. And I think that by providing the train with brakes, we're doing all we need for this particular purpose.
This is the lady in the second row.
Caroline Mileto, an alumni of Johns Hopkins University and working at Sodexo in corporate responsibility, so trying to invest in the long term as well. Just to follow up with that comment, that not only have we put the brakes on the train, but we've also educated the driver to pull the brakes at the right time. And I think this education piece is the crucial step we need to do today in order to be able to act tomorrow. But actually, the question I had is coming back to the romantic nihilist of happiness believers. What I wanted to underline is the problem with the GDP, not that GDP is not the right answer in order to foster growth and economic activity. It's just that the GDP as such does not value public outcome, it does value output. And I have quite a good example there that I use quite a number of times. My mom is a professor, which will resonate with you, who invests time, energy, and money in terms of lost opportunity of working in the private sector in investing in her students. Her students get the great master's degree. She works up a great network to put them in a great in great firms after that. Now, I compare that with friends of mine who are finance bankers who invest time, skills, and energy into investing in the right assets, people assets. Now, if the assets turns out to be successful, they get a return, their bonus. They get a returns. And I'm wondering, could my mom get a return on the salary of her students just because she has invested the right skills and the right time into them to make them productive, the way that the financial assets are productive? No, it would be wrong, right? However, what is lost there is that in the financial assets, we're not necessarily sure that the public outcome is produced. We're certain that the output is being produced and it's being captured by the GDP. Now, in terms of skills in society and having bright young people getting a job in a company, this public outcome is not captured by GDP and is not, therefore, there are no incentive for individual people to follow on the markets to go into creating public outcome. Rather, it's going towards the activities that produce outputs. And that's where I'm coming back and being a bit skeptical about the whole GDP thing, that it's really promoting the right type of activities and having a sustainable development of economic activities.
Interesting question. So there's a wider point there, maybe even about the way that public services are not really fully captured in GDP.
I'm saying that I think GDP is a a good measure to have. Doesn't mean I think it's the perfect measure, and you've obviously touched on one of the most important drawbacks of it, which is that it's a market measure. It includes goods and services that are sold in the market and is very bad at measuring, capturing the ones that are not sold in the market. So as well as a lot of kind of service activities of like teaching or caring or being a nurse, which it measures badly. There's all the unpaid work in the home, if it's in the market and paid for, it's in GDP, and if it's not. So the kind of time use studies that Jonathan Bashuni was talking about last week, I think are a really interesting supplement to GDP. So I completely acknowledge that problem, but still say GDP is a useful measure to have. Let's stick with it. It measures something important. Your second part of the problem, though, I think is a completely different issue. And bankers being overpaid has nothing to do with the flaws of the market, because it's not a competitive market. There is a monopoly. They're extracting monopoly rents in investment banking. They have poor governance of the banks. They have a monopoly in the markets in which they operate. So that's a pure monopoly rent. And if we had competition, effective competition in banking, they wouldn't get paid the bonuses they do.
I was picking on bankers in the current climate, just for the sake of it. Was just using the example of the model.
But the other examples,
the model that is used.
The other examples will be monopoly rents as well. So footballers who get very well paid have got the monopoly rents not only of their own skills, but of the kind of broadcast rights that are in the monopolistic, oligopolistic markets. So whenever you see that kind of salary payment, there's something that's not competitive going on there.
Jeremy?
Yes, I did. I cannot claim any great familiarity with economic theory, but looking at the rather dark picture set out by both of our speakers, whether with Diane in the expected gap between future government future expenditure commitments and future revenue, or, as Avner pointed out, in the hardwired tendency in human nature to discount the future. How far do people who think seriously about social and economic questions need to ponder the necessity of developed Western societies imposing legal restraints upon themselves in some form of entrenched legislation? What I have in mind here is the recent amendment to the Basic Law in Germany, in which a certain proportion of deficit was actually entrenched legislation, which could not be overturned except by a further constitutional amendment. And also the suggestion of that hardened old cynic, Jacques Chirac, just before he had his stroke in the middle of the last decade, that environmental rights should be written into the French Constitution. How far, in short, if I'm sort of at the risk of harking back to my Belgian ancestors, do we need to think of the need to build dikes to hold back the sea of instability and to maintain? But it's just a thought.
I think these are exactly the kind of commitment devices that Avner's territory, so he can listen.
Yeah, well, I think that if we're really time inconsistent, then the idea that we can actually coerce our successors is delusional. So that kind of thing is the sort of thing that's designed to bring constitutions into disrepute. So if people will only obey codes and constraints of this kind up to a point. If it hurts too much, and they'll say, why should we? It has all sorts of perverse incentives as well. Having said that, I actually think that myopia gives us a tool where we can take advantage of this cognitive bias in order to coerce the future to some extent. And maybe can I take the liberty of showing the diagram I've kept in reserve?
I think you should.
Come on, Avner, unveil your secret weapon.
Yeah, okay. So we'll skip this. I have other secret weapons. Okay, so this is hyperbolic discount as a commitment device. Yes, so let's imagine for the moment that what's going to solve both our energy problem and our global warming problem is to stop cheap floods. If you suggest that to an ordinary voter or indeed to an ordinary politician, they will say, as Tony Blair said, well, you know, global warming is all very well, but this is a complete non-starter. There's no way we can do this. The point is that we can't do this now, but maybe we can do this in the future. Now, what I've done here is I've taken, this is exponential discounting, I've converted it into a straight line. And this is hyperbolic discounting. So the nice thing about hyperbolic discounting is that the present is worth a great deal to us, but the immediate future is worth much, much less. On the other hand, the very remote distance is actually worth rather more. That's just mathematical properties of the curve. So what happens? We say we're not going to stop cheap flights now. We're going to stop them in 7 years' time. Now, in 7 years' time, yes, so we credibly pre-commit to restrict flights at point t equals 7. I'm not sure we write this into the Constitution. Maybe legislation is enough. Sorry. Yes. So what you can see is that 7 years hence are worth, with standard exponential discounting, 2/3 of what they're worth now. But with hyperbolic discounting, they're worth 1/3 of what they're worth now. So taking advantage of this innate myopia, we can lock in the future. Now, you can tell that to politicians, and they will tell you that's what we've been doing all along. So you can see that when the government wants to introduces in the pension age, they don't do it immediately, they do it in 10 years' time. When Paul Rand wants to close down Medicare, he doesn't do it today, he does it when everyone living today is dead. Now, you can bring this method into disrepute. I think New Labour really took this method for a ride by legislating for 2050, legislating emission quotas for 2050. I think that is the sort of thing which brings legislation into disrepute. Nevertheless, the fact that politicians have picked this up indicates that there are some things, some attributes of cognitive equipment which we can use to help us cope with issues of this kind.
Actually, the German amendment was with the time today, and perhaps that might be a consequence of the scientifically literate Chancellor.
Could I add, I think legal commitments are actually less useful than emotional and moral commitments. And I've been pondering the Cold War example. I still go back to the Victorians, and I think the example of the Victorian idea of progress and moral improvement and improvability is probably something of the same kind of commitment device as the Cold War, just a bit less gloomy.
What sort of sacrifices does it require? That's really the test. The test of a norm. A norm is only interesting if you make a sacrifice for it.
The personal sacrifice is involved in self-improvement.
Oh, self-improvement. Is that the same as progress? Well, never mind. That's not
It's a tangent.
So, one thought that I had about all this is, I mean, it's a bit like sort of St. Augustine's thing about making me good, but not just yet. I mean, we have tried to do this. We've set endless future targets for decarbonisation, 40 or 30 or 40 different targets in the UK alone. And when we've missed them, we've just gone on set new, more ambitious targets and cruise past them as well. Isn't there a problem with this kind of legislative target setting in the environment?
You're asking me whether there's a problem. Well, there is a problem. You know, I think it requires a bit of finesse. The question is, you know, what can you lock in that way? What we need to remember, it's not only the populists who are myopic. The politicians are just as myopic, perhaps even more so. So how serious are the politicians with these kinds of intentions? Nevertheless, this is a technology. And it bears thinking about what things can be done with it, what things can't be done with this. This is just an imaginary example, but I can imagine being actually able to calibrate this, being actually able to develop a model that's based on real data to do that kind of thing. Let's not get too excited. By the way, all my economic examples are tongue-in-cheek, so don't take them too seriously. That's just a way of thinking. So.
to learn from the answer to coming out for a second.
Yes, I also
second
asked
vote
Diane
for
a
the chair.
question, which is you raised this idea of working out where we stand with respect to the next generation. And I just wondered if you had any sense of where we stand with respect to the next generation. Should I feel guilty when I look my daughter in the eye, or should I in fact be spending hell for leather and leaving her with a tax bill? I mean, do we have some sense of the way it is going?
I heard Axel Weber talk about this, and he said it was only sort of half tongue in cheek that the next generation is voting in the only way it knows how by not being born. And the demographic catastrophe, actually, in Germany and Italy, is really staggering. And I do think it's a measure of the kind of impact that choices now are having on very immediately on the next generation. It varies from country to country. A 20% increase in tax bills to get sustainable public finances for the UK, it doesn't sound catastrophic. Are we taking the political choices that show our seriousness about the next generation? If you look at any recent budget, it's the over 75s who appear to have been protected, and cuts fall on younger people. So I think in that sense we're not doing well at all.
I think this is a little less alarming than you presented. And the reason for that is, once again, we shouldn't take these contracts too seriously. So what we cannot meet is our obligations as they are. Even leaving ourselves at the current level of taxation, we can meet 20% less. So it's not a matter of either paying everyone a pension or throwing everyone into the gutter. It's a matter of degree, and I think it's important to see how these things are done. These things are not locked in by legislation. They're actually a continuous process of negotiation between the producers of the moment and the dependents of the moment. And this is done by means of the political system. And so long as society retains a grip on some kind of civilized values, and so long as society retains some notion of a future in which they themselves will participate, then I think that so long as your prediction of continued growth is maintained, then this will be sorted out. I don't think it's the end of the world by any means. I think the real worry is if the sort of scenario that I've drawn out comes about, in which we don't have economic growth, not because of romantic nihilism, but because maybe the resources that we're endowed with don't allow us. I think that is when the real crunch would come.
But at what point do you think the political decision-making tips in favour of the younger rather than the older generations, which is a point we're not at yet?
Well, we are actually at it. This negotiation is actually taking place as we speak. Pension terms are being revised. The updating of pensions has just been shifted from RPI to CPI. These things are happening all the time. And as we're growing wealthier, it actually tipped in favor, and as people are getting older, it tipped in favor of old people, but it might well tip in favor of young people. I'd say something else. It doesn't even have to be done through legislation. Because another mechanism, don't forget that these entitlements are pretty much in nominal terms. They're not inflation indexed. So if we have all their inflation indexing is only quite limited, cannot withstand the real value of inflation. If the younger generation decide that they cannot afford to pay for the old, they'll ask for higher wages, everything will become more expensive, this pension will not go as far, and the market will sort this out. So I think there's less to be alarmed about the contracts we're signing on. I think the real issue is whether we're going to have the economic growth we expect.
Interesting. So, who you jump that?
Just to continue the point, I mean, do you think that both of you think that the culture of pessimism, which is hardly new in any generation, but just seems to be more extreme now, might actually lead to the sort of policies that undermine economic growth, which by and large you're saying is the solution to the problem, because the degree to which that is widespread is perhaps just a little bit unusual this time, be it peak oil, or the impact of global warming, or the impact of demographics. I mean, the amount of scares around these seem to be greater. It's hard to compare generations. Seem to be greater, and they seem to be irrational. So, do you think that that could actually be the cause of the next problem, the cultural change that goes with that? If you use the 2050 example, I think at the very, very last moment, without any consideration, in the bill, in the climate change bill, which is now the Climate Change Act, in 2008, they changed it to 80% cuts in emissions by 2050. They actually walked into the chamber, House of Commons, thinking it could be 60%. It was just a sort of, let's do even more, let's even be more hair-shirted. But the impact of that is actually costing us now. So I think the figure, if I'm right, is about 18 billion a year on electricity bills in the UK alone, almost now. So these are material impacts that are slowing us down now that could actually generate the trigger, the sort of negativity in terms of the outcome that we're supposed to be trying to avoid.
But the sort of self-fulfilling prophecy.
Well, the self-fulfilling is mechanism. Innovation, growth is about innovation, including energy saving or carbon reducing innovation. But people undertaking that and making the investments that they need depends on what their expectations about the future are. So that degree of pessimism or optimism does matter. And it's another reason I find the Victorian era so compelling, because that sense of onward and upward definitely fed back into the extent to which people were willing to invest and experiment. So I think it does matter. The other thing about, just going back to the previous discussion as well, about flexible adaptations to aging, I certainly agree, and I think people will obviously work longer, but this is an anecdote. I had a taxi ride home last night, and my taxi driver said, I'm 73 now, I'm going to carry on working for another 7 years or so, because I just get home. I just get bored at home sitting, and my pension's not very big, so I've got to work really. And that was great, but we did drive home with 30 miles an hour.
It sort of slightly raises a question which I was interested to push you a little bit further on, Professor, but which is about, you argued that affluence had undermined commitment devices. There's this thought out there that consumerism is bad for our self-control. Would you mind saying a little bit more about why that is so in your view?
Yeah, the model is fairly simple. The thing about innovation is that we don't know whether they're good or bad for us. They look good, but maybe they become bad. A good example of that is tobacco. So tobacco is very nice to smoke, makes you feel good. It took several decades to work out that it wasn't so good. So when we're faced by a new reward of that kind, effectively we have no way of evaluating this. What this means is that it imparts short-term bias to our behavior. Yes, we respond to this immediate incentive, which in this case was tobacco, and our whole behavior becomes more short-termist. Now, short-termist is not so good because we can think of well-being as, that's one of the models, as a kind of arousal, and it can easily be swamped by stimulation. Yes, I say stimulation in the general sense. It can easily be swamped by stimulation. Let me give you an example. So we can do music in a variety of ways. We can learn to play an instrument, or we can play a CD. Yes, these are operations that cover very different time spans, requires very different types of investment. I can well imagine myself, only imagine, I wouldn't ever think of doing this, going to, say, a club. And, one of the effects of going to a club is that people suffer hearing impairments because every vendor of music leapfrogs the other by making it a little bit louder. If I learn to play if I learn to play an instrument, this is something that's a gift that never stops giving, but it's on a completely different time scale. So the point is that the flow of innovation undermines our existing commitment devices. Obesity is also quite a nice example of that. I don't know whether I should go on. So in the 50s, if you wanted a cooked meal, then you had to go home, and with apologies, it was cooked by your wife, who statistically was no more than an average cook, and you could only have it 3 times a day. So, the possibilities were quite limited, and as a consequence, most people were within the normative range of weight. Nowadays, you can feed yourself 24/7. There are no limits to that, and some people find that quite difficult to resist, and as a consequence of that, we have a problem with overweight. We have a problem with obesity, which even the people who suffer from it regret it, or most of them regret it, although some Chicago economists say that if they choose to be there, that must be good for them, even if they say it isn't. So, these are examples, and I could give other examples. Actually, some of the most interesting examples are in the area of romantic relationships, but if you want to find out, you'll have to read the book.
As they say, sex does sell.
Available in paperback.
I think we're coming towards the end of the time. I think there was another question towards the front. I think Jeremy had us.
My fox has been shot for me.
Oh, solidly shot. Or were there any?
Andrew briefly from Policy Exchange. A question for Professor Offer. Diane mentioned at the beginning that she took the scene setting of the crash, the financial crash in 2008, and going to the cash machine, taking out cash, stocking up on tin, food, and bottled water. I just wondered, Professor Offer, given your sort of scene setting of all these various impending crises, if there's anything that you're doing in your personal life to sort of to mitigate the risks or to act prudently. I noticed you, by accidental design, you're based in Oxford, so presumably you don't need a car to get to work. You sort of do anything else?
I don't even need to go to work. I can stay at home. Well, I actually did nothing of the kind. I had this naive faith that our leaders would see us through, which they did in this case. This was naive. So, no, I didn't. This is actually quite an interesting question.
You were lucky.
For example, George Monbiot, various sort of eco-greens have retreated to hilltop farms in Wales to minimise their exposure to
Yes, actually, it's interesting that you mentioned that. There is a literature which I suppose I'd call the collapse literature. So these are people who take my scenario seriously. And say better safe than sorry. Yes, essentially. They also say it's not certain. Actually, some of them say it is certain. But they say better safe than sorry. And so there's a whole kind of sub-literature. Oh yes, and if this is going to happen, so some people think about how to save humanity. Those sort of people usually write a book. Other people think about how they might save themselves. And so there's a rush, if I may call it, of people who are devising personal survival strategies of various kinds. And that's worth a study in itself. But one of the most articulate of these people has actually taken his prognosis to the logical extreme. And he lives in a sailing boat. Because by the way, he's a wonderful writer, and let me recommend him. His name is Dmitry Orlov. The book is called Reinventing Collapse. You probably heard of it. Yes. So he lives in a sailboat, and he says sailboat is the best place to be because if you need something, you can go there, and people will want you to carry things hither and thither, so you can offer them something useful. I think this is taking the to extreme, but some people might say that living on a sailing boat is a nice idea anyway.
I'm afraid we are now out of time. Diane and Avner, fascinating session this evening. We've talked about all kinds of different things. They are, I think, related in all kinds of different ways. You've both presented very interestingly and amusingly. So thank you so much, and thank all of you for very good and interesting questions. Cheers.